Okay, so try and picture this. It's 19th century Lower Manhattan, and you've got this chaotic mess of streets colliding, Anthony Street smashing into Cross, Orange, and this little lane, Little Water Street, which isn't even there anymore.
Right, that's the spot, the 5 points.
Exactly. Squeezed right between Broadway, which is already booming, and the gritty Bowery. It's basically where Chinatown is today.
And it wasn't just any rough neighborhood. Charles Dickens visited, and even he, someone who knew London's slums, was apparently just floored by the poverty.
Yeah, which tells you something. So let's really get into this, because this wasn't just a place. This whole convergence of streets and, frankly, desperation, it didn't just create a neighborhood, it became a breeding ground for something infamous.
The 5 Points Gang.
Precisely. So that's our deep dive today. We're going into the history, the origins, the rise, the eventual fall of the 5 Points Gang using the historical info we have.
Yeah, pulling out the really interesting bits, trying to understand how that specific time and place could birth such a, well, notorious group.
And for you listening, this isn't just, dry history. It's really about understanding the forces, the environment that can shape a community, maybe uncovering some hidden stories.
And seeing how those forces created something like this gang and the impact it had. It starts with who was even living there, right? The demographics were shifting constantly.
Yeah, initially it was, English and Scots-Irish settlers?
Primarily. But then, by the 1840s, you get these huge waves of immigrants pouring in, German, Welsh, and especially Irish refugees, often fleeing the famine.
And they weren't exactly welcomed with open arms, were they? Particularly Irish Catholics.
Not at all. They faced intense ethnic prejudice, serious class discrimination from the established nativist groups, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants already there.
You can almost feel that pressure cooker situation. People marginalized, needing to find ways to survive, maybe push back.
And that's exactly where we see the first glimmers of organized groups. These early Irish street gangs started forming. Names like the Carryonians, the 40 Thieves.
The Shirt Tails, the Chichesters, catchy names.
Yeah. And while maybe they started out partly for mutual support against this hostility.
We pretty quickly turned to crime, didn't they?
Oh, yeah. It became a way to survive, maybe exert some control, limited job prospects, discrimination. Crime became an avenue, petty theft, extortion, that sort of thing.
But these specific gangs, they didn't last forever, these pre-Civil War ones.
No, they sort of faded out or morphed. Their members often got absorbed into newer, tougher gangs that emerged later, like the infamous Dead Rabbits and the Weos.
Okay, so the landscape is already changing, but then it changes again, massively.
Right, by the 1870s, you get another big shift. New immigrant groups arrive, Italians, mainly Southern Italians, and Eastern European Jews.
So now the 5 Points area is even more of a melting pot, but also probably more competition.
Exactly. Competition for space, for jobs, and crucially, for control of the illicit rackets. You start seeing clashes between Irish, Jewish, and Italian gangs.
And you mentioned Monk Eastman's gang earlier, how they started Irish but became more Jewish. That really shows the shift.
It does. The Eastman coin collectors, yeah.
It
It reflected that demographic change. And it's out of this really volatile, competitive environment that the 5 Points Gang proper starts to coalesce.
Led by one key figure, right? Paul Kelly.
Paul Kelly, yeah. Born Paolo Antonio Vaccarelli, an Italian-American. He's really seen as the organizer, the guy who pulled these different elements together into something more cohesive, more powerful.
Interesting that an Italian-American is leading a gang that, initially at least, had a lot of Irish members.
It was predominantly Irish at the very start, but the Italian presence grew rapidly and eventually became dominant under Kelly.
Yeah.
But the key thing, the constant factor, was that these guys were nearly always immigrants or first-generation kids.
Which makes sense. They're outsiders, maybe feeling like they have less to lose, or that the gang is their only path to, well, something. Power, respect, money.
It offered a structure, a sense of belonging maybe, that mainstream society denied them, and they quickly got a reputation.
For brutality.
Extreme brutality. They were known for fighting literally to the death against rivals. No holding back.
And Kelly wasn't just a tough guy. He was smart. He actively recruited, right? Pulled in remnants of those older gangs.
Absolutely. Dead Rabbits, YOs, anyone useful who was left. It was a strategic move, consolidating power in the 5 Points neighborhood.
And their activities, it wasn't just street fighting, it was a whole portfolio of crime.
Oh, completely. Racketeering was huge, controlling local businesses through protection money. Election fraud was maybe their most important tool for influence.
Voter intimidation, stuffing ballot boxes,
Yeah.
that kind of thing.
All of it. plus extortion, drug trafficking, prostitution, pimping, illegal gambling operations, robbery, fraud,
Yeah.
and yeah, plenty of murder, knife fights, shootouts. They were involved in almost everything illicit.
And they weren't alone. They had allies, other gangs.
Yeah, they networked, sometimes allied with groups like the Yaki Yakes, the Gopher Gang over on the west side, the Hudson Dusters, even the YOs for a time,
Yeah.
and connections to early mafia families like the Morellos. Later on, links to the Bugs and Meyer Gang, too. It was a complex web,
But the biggest connection, the one that really gave them power, was Tammany Hall.
without a doubt. Tammany Hall, the corrupt Democratic Party political machine that ran New York City for decades. The Five Points Gang delivered votes for Tammany politicians.
Through those methods you mentioned, intimidation, fake voter lists, ballot stuffing.
Exactly. And in return, Tammany Hall provided political cover, protection from serious police interference or prosecution. It was a symbiotic, corrupt relationship.
But they didn't have the whole Lower East Side to themselves, so there was Monk Eastman.
Their biggest rival, Monk Eastman and his gang, controlled a huge chunk of territory, and they were constantly clashing with the Five Pointers over boundaries and rackets around the turn of the 20th century.
And this wasn't just minor skirmishes, it got really bad.
It escalated into full-blown war. There were shootings back and forth. Eastman himself got shot at one point. Then a five-pointer was killed in retaliation.
And then that massive fight in 1903.
Yeah, incredible story. Something like 50 guys on each side, just openly battling with guns in the streets. The police actually had to pull back for a while. People were killed, many wounded.
Yeah.
Total chaos.
Eastman gets arrested after that, but Tammany springs him almost immediately.
Yep, shows their influence.
Yeah.
But the public was furious about the violence. It was just too blatant. So Tammany, feeling the pressure,
Tried to make peace.
they leaned on both Kelly and Eastman. Tom Foley, a Tammany leader, tried to broker a truce.
Which led to that boxing match. Seriously.
Seriously.
Mm.
Kelly versus Eastman in a ring up in the Bronx, supposedly to settle things. They apparently went at it hammer and tongs for 2 hours.
And
It was declared a draw, and the fighting between the gangs just picked right back up again. Didn't solve a thing.
So Tammany had to pick a side.
Eventually, yes. And they chose Kelly and the Five Points Gang. They withdrew their support, their protection, from Monk Eastman.
Which basically sealed his fate.
Pretty much. Without Tammany's backing, the police finally went after him seriously. He was arrested for robbery in 1904, convicted, and sent up the river to Sing Sing.
Wow. So with Eastman gone.
The Five Points Gang was basically king of the hill, the dominant force in Lower East Side organized crime. They started expanding their influence, moving into other parts of Manhattan, even into New Jersey.
And Eastman's successor, what happened to him? Kid Twist.
Max Kid Twist, Zurbach. He didn't last long. He was murdered in Coney Island in 1908, allegedly by Five Points hitmen, possibly on Kelly's orders, though that's debated. It's certainly removed another rival.
And Kelly himself. He started to change his image a bit.
He did. He seemed to adopt a more business-like approach, less street brawler, more organizer. He opened the New Brighton Athletic Club on Great Jones Street.
Which wasn't just a gym, right?
Oh, no. It was a facade, a dance hall, saloon, a place where politicians, gangsters, and even some socialites could mingle. Kelly held court there.
And he himself was surprisingly sophisticated.
Remarkably so, by all accounts. He dressed well, was fluent in several languages, Italian, French, Spanish, apparently, liked fine art, classical music.
That's not the image you usually get of a gang leader from that era.
No, it allowed him to move in different circles, to charm people, including powerful figures outside the underworld. It was part of his strategy, his persona.
But that couldn't shield him forever. That assassination attempt in 1905, right in his own club.
Yeah, a huge event. Two of his own former top guys, Biff Ellison and Pat Razor Riley, tried to kill him right there in the New Brighton. Kelly was wounded, but survived.
That must have shaken things up. And Tammany wasn't happy.
Not at all. The publicity was terrible. Tammany pressured Kelly to lay low, and the police eventually shut down the New Brighton. That really marked the beginning of the end for his absolute dominance.
So his power started to wane, but he didn't just disappear.
No, he adapted again. He shifted his focus more towards Italian immigrant communities, uptown in Harlem, over in Brooklyn. Still had connections downtown, but wasn't the undisputed king anymore.
And then he got involved with the unions, the longshoremen.
Yeah, quite a turn. He became involved with the International Longshoremen's Association, the ILA. Even became a vice president for a while. Got kicked out, then somehow got back in.
Led a strike, even.
A big one, yeah. A port-wide strike in 1919. They were protesting for a tiny 5-cent wage increase. Kelly ended up on a commission to resolve it. Quite the journey from street gang leader.
So he became more of a labor racketeer in his later years.
That seems to be the case through the 1920s. And then, kind of surprisingly, he died of natural causes in 1936. Not the violent end you might expect.
But as Kelly faded and the Five Points gang itself declined, something else was rising to take its place.
Exactly. The Italian mafia gangs were steadily taking over the territories and the rackets that the Five Pointers once controlled.
And here's the really critical connection, isn't it? The guys who became the big names in the mafia.
Many of them got their start in the Five Points gang. It was like a finishing school for future mob bosses.
Johnny Torrio, Al Capone.
Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky. These giants of 20th century organized crime all had roots in the Five Points gang.
That's incredible. And you mentioned Arnold Rothstein, the gambler and financier, as a kind of mentor figure.
Rothstein was influential, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
He saw the potential in guys like Luciano and Lansky, helped them think bigger, organized crime more like a business, expanding operations beyond just local neighborhoods, nationally, even internationally.
And then came Prohibition in 1920.
The game changer. Suddenly, there was unimaginable money to be made in illegal liquor. Bootlegging.
And these former Five Pointers were perfectly positioned.
Absolutely. They had the organization, the ruthlessness, the connections. Torrio famously went to Chicago, brought Capone with him, and they built that massive bootlegging empire. Prohibition fueled the rise of the modern mafia, largely led by Five Points alumni.
And Torrio later helped create the National Crime Syndicate, trying to organize crime across the country.
He played a key role in that, yes, trying to bring order, reduce infighting, and maximize profits nationally.
So, just to sort of wrap this up, it's a fascinating arc. The Five Points gang starts in this incredibly tough, impoverished immigrant neighborhood.
Born from prejudice and hardship, yeah.
They fight their way up to become this dominant power in New York's underworld, tied into the city's political machine.
Wielding real influence for a time.
And then, maybe the most significant part of their legacy is that the very people who came up through their ranks went on to define organized crime in America for the next 50 years.
It's an extraordinary story of succession, almost. The training ground for the next generation.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? How much does that specific environment, the poverty, the discrimination, the density of the Five Points, how much did that directly shape the kind of criminal enterprise that emerged?
That's the big question to ponder, I think. The interplay between environment and outcome. And also, just the cyclical nature of power. How one group, even a notorious one like the Five Points gang, ultimately paves the way for whoever comes next.
A cycle playing out even in the shadows definitely gives you something to mull over. If this has piqued your interest, and how could it not, we really encourage you to dig deeper. Look into the history of New York City immigration, Tammany Hall, the evolution of organized crime. It's a deep, often dark, but endlessly fascinating part of American history.